Recently, I traveled to Silicon Valley on a business trip with 6 early-stage tech startups that my team and I are mentoring. Today, I will share 3 life-changing elements that form the Silicon Valley mindset. The mindset that made Silicon Valley the most influential ecosystem for tech startups such as Apple, Facebook, and Tesla. First element of the Silicon Valley mindset: there is no risk. People in the US have a different mindset compared to the rest of the world, especially when compared to Central Europe. Additionally, within the US, those living in Silicon Valley possess yet another unique mindset. I learned this from their interpretation of the phrase, "I can do this." When people in the Silicon Valley say "I can do this," they typically mean something radically different compared to the rest of the world. Outside of Silicon Valley, when people say "I can do this," they generally imply the following. Look, I've spent the last 10 years of my life working in this field. I have obtained a PhD on this topic. I have successfully solved this exact problem numerous times before, therefore I'm confident in saying I can do this. However, in Silicon Valley, when people say "I can do this," they actually mean I have overcome many difficult problems in my life. I have gained extensive experiences in various challenging areas. That is why I know I can acquire all the necessary knowledge and skills to accomplish this specific task. Hence, I am confident in saying I can do this. This mindset shift means that startup founders need to adapt their approach when hiring the right talent and raising capital for their business in Silicon Valley. According to founders I spoke who moved from Germany to the Silicon Valley, investors in the US care much less about technology. This doesn't mean that they don't care about founders' credentials and the technology at all, but it does mean that technology is much less important compared to investors in the US. However, what US investors truly care about is the business model. They want to know who the customers are, the customer's lifetime value, the customer's acquisition cost, how quickly a business can close new customers, and how satisfied the customers are with the business solution. Ultimately, the most important question for US investors is whether the startup has a great business model or not. US investors tend to place quick trust in startup founders who possess the right credentials to solve technical issues and build a successful business. As a result, these investors prioritize business metrics. However, this focus can sometimes lead investors to overly trust founders based on their credentials, which makes them susceptible to falling for over-optimistic or even scammy founders. This has been observed numerous times before, as evidenced by well-known alleged scams such as Theranos, Nikola, IRL, and Frank, where founders were unable to fulfill their promises and in some cases allegedly lied about their customers' numbers. Nevertheless, in general, the Silicon Valley mindset means that investors are more willing to take a chance on what may appear to be a risky business endeavor. Interestingly, when it comes to early-stage startup investments such as pre-seed and seed phases, this is typically the time when founders have a small team and they have built their first prototypes. They may even have some pilot customers. The median investment in this early startup phase is very similar in both the EU and US markets. According to Crunchbase, the median seed and pre-seed funding round in Europe in 2021 was $1 million compared to 1.3 million in the US. Therefore, there is no significant difference here. However, the significant disparity lies in the number of startups funded in an early stage. Despite the US economy being roughly 50% larger than the EU economy, there were 138 more early-stage startup investments in the US. This highlights the cultural difference between the two markets. US investors are more inclined to invest in early-stage startups, while EU investors tend to be more conservative. I understand that this approach to research is not completely accurate. I had a hypothesis and was seeking ways to support my assumptions with data. However, this is not a very scientific method. Ideally, one should analyze the data first and then derive conclusions based on this. But then again, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a person who records YouTube videos. By the way, if you enjoy this type of content and would like to learn more about entrepreneurship, please let me know by liking this video. It helps me tailor topics to your interests. Although I only spent 1 week in Silicon Valley, I immediately recognized the second element of the Silicon Valley mindset: ecosystem is key. In Silicon Valley, it feels like Everybody is embarking on a new project. Most are either founding startups, joining startups, transitioning between business ideas, investing in startups, or mentoring startup founders. Investors in Silicon Valley prefer the startup founders that they back remain in the region. They recognize that no global ecosystem supports startup founders better than Silicon Valley does. With the world's best tech talent, a concentration of investors, and the legacy of successful tech companies, Silicon Valley offers an unparalleled environment for founders. The sheer density of this ecosystem means it's almost impossible not to meet somebody who can either directly help your venture or introduce you to somebody who can. And this has a profound impact on founders. Depending on where we grew up and where we went to school, starting a business makes us somewhat stand out. Being an entrepreneur can often feel isolating as it sets us apart from the norm. This is definitely how I felt like when I grew up as a teenager and started my first startup in my 20s. Whenever I told somebody about my business, they would be very surprised and also a bit in disbelief because they had never met somebody who started their own business. This frequently happened to me, and I started hating about my business because people's questions about my startup never ended, and I hated answering the same questions over and over to people who were not truly able to contribute or were not interested in the scene or in my startup, but more viewed me as a curiosity in their normal lives. And this is the great thing about Silicon Valley. Because everybody is somehow involved in the startup scene and the ecosystems themselves, you don't really stand out that much anymore. It really feels like coming home in a place where you are surrounded by like-minded people. But does this mean we should all move to Silicon Valley? While doing so might be very beneficial for your personal development and your startup success, I believe that we can build our own ecosystems wherever we are. Social media has allowed us to form friendships over vast distances. This means we can connect to like-minded individuals and benefit from creating our own individual ecosystem. A great way to do so is meetup.com, where we can find local and online meetups for any specific interest. We all might have our unique projects, but often our problems are very similar. How do we build successful products that our customers love? How can we attract the right talent for our team? How can we raise capital from investors for our business? These are just some of the questions and problems that all startups have in common. Another important aspect is founders must be optimistic when it comes to their success. But how do we define success? What does it mean to be successful? For most tech founders, this means monetary success, raising millions, having irreplicable tech, closing customers, and having millions in revenue. In most countries outside the US, not achieving this means failure. Most people are so afraid of failure that this fear paralyzes them from taking action, which brings me to the third element of the Silicon Valley mindset: failure is good. For YouTubers, it is a great practice to include inspirational quotes when they want to emphasize a certain point. So what I did is I quickly researched for quotes on failure because I wanted to find some meaningful quote that highlights the concept of failure, but also showcases my intelligence. After reading dozens of quotes on failure, I found them to be extremely cheesy and somewhat cringeworthy. But then I actually stumbled upon this one quote by Confucius that I thought truly captures the Silicon Valley mindset. Our greatest glory is not in never failing, but in rising every time we fail. This is the true essence of the Silicon Valley mindset. Let me explain why. As a founder, you start with hypotheses. Initially, you assume that your customers would want to have product X with features Y. Since startups innovate, there is no historical data from successful companies to research and prove your assumptions. Therefore, we have to build a prototype of our offering and bring it to the market. Show your customers the prototype and try to sell to them. After all, we are trying to build businesses and not conduct a research project, right? This means we experiment with our hypotheses by going to the market and attempting to sell our prototypes. This can lead to three potential outcomes. 1, success. If your hypothesis is correct, you should double down on your project. 2, failure. If your hypothesis is wrong and your customers don't want your product, you need to go back to the drawing board and change your assumptions. 3. Mediocre success. But what should we do now? We haven't clearly succeeded, so we can't really double down, but we haven't even failed, so we can't learn new lessons. In this case, there's nothing to learn and no changes to be made in order to build an even better offer. As a founder, it is important not to fear failure. However, what we should strive to avoid is mediocre success. Failure presents us with the opportunity to iterate and make changes to our approach. On the other hand, mediocre success keeps us in a state of limbo. It leaves us uncertain about which direction to take, whether it be left or right at the fork of the road. This is also why I, as an entrepreneur, love YouTube. It enables me to create weekly videos or products that I can test the market with. As a viewer, you can vote with your attention, your thumbs up, and with your comments. This provides me a clear signal to adjust my approach in the next video or double down on what works. So why not participate in this circle of continuous improvement by clicking or tapping on the thumbs up button? You can also let me know in the comment section what you would want to learn more about in entrepreneurship and tech. So ultimately, failure is good. Of course, success is better. However, failure is still valuable because it opens up new possibilities. As startup founders, our task is to define our hypotheses and determine what failure means to us, allowing us to avoid mediocrity and strive for success. However, there is also another aspect to failure in Silicon Valley. I cannot speak for your country or the specific culture that you grew up in, but in the German culture where I grew up, failure tends to be condemned. Failure is seen as a sickness that one needs to keep a distance from. In German culture, failure is pitied and people do not want to be associated with failure. However, the culture in Silicon Valley is radically different as it embraces failure. Investors understand that founders often take multiple attempts before achieving success. Therefore, they do not reject founders solely based on past failures. Instead, they're interested in learning what lessons the founders have learned from their past failures. And founders can benefit from having co-founders who bring valuable startup experience, even if it includes previous failures. And finally, to avoid failure means to avoid trying. As Confucius said, our glory does not come from avoiding failure, it comes from getting back up. And to everybody out there appreciating the Silicon Valley mindset because they understand that there is no real risk. To everybody building their own ecosystem of founders, mentors, and investors, and to everyone understanding that real glory comes not from avoiding failure, but from rising. Every time we fail, I say, be bold and be brave.